The dawn of ancient Egypt, from early settlements to the rise of civilization. Ancient Egypt, one of the most fascinating and enduring civilizations in history, emerged in the northeastern corner of Africa, primarily along the fertile banks of the Nile River. This river, often considered the lifeline of Egypt, supported the rise of an advanced and influential civilization. The development of Egyptian civilization from the earliest settlements to its peak of power and influence is a captivating story of innovation, cultural evolution, and remarkable achievements in various fields. Early settlements and the Neolithic period. The earliest known human settlements in Egypt date back to the Neolithic period, around 7,000 years before Christ. During this time, small communities began to form along the Nile Valley, attracted by the fertile land and abundant water supply. These early settlers were primarily hunter-gatherers, but they gradually transitioned to a more settled, agrarian lifestyle. The domestication of plants and animals played a crucial role in this transformation, leading to the development of agriculture. By 500 years before Christ, these early communities had begun to engage in farming, cultivating crops such as wheat and barley, and raising livestock, including cattle and sheep. The ability to produce surplus food allowed these communities to grow in size and complexity. Settlements became more permanent, with the construction of rudimentary dwellings made from mud brick and reeds. The pre-dynastic period. The period between 500 years before Christ and 3,100 years before Christ is known as the pre-dynastic period. During this time, the small, scattered communities along the Nile began to coalesce into larger, more organized societies. Two distinct cultural groups emerged: the Naqada culture in Upper Egypt, Southern Egypt, and the Budomati culture in Lower Egypt, Northern Egypt. The Naqada culture, which flourished from around 4,400 years before Christ to 3,000 years before Christ, is particularly notable for its advances in pottery, metallurgy, and social organization. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Hierakonpolis and Abydos reveals a society that was becoming increasingly complex, with signs of emerging social stratification and centralized authority. In Lower Egypt, the Budomati culture, approximately 4,000 years before Christ to 3,200 years before Christ, also displayed significant developments, particularly in trade and interaction with neighboring regions. The Nile Delta became a hub of commerce, facilitating the exchange of goods and ideas with the Levant and Mesopotamia. Unification in the early dynastic period. The culmination of these cultural and social developments was the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, traditionally attributed to the legendary figure of King Menes around 3,100 years before Christ. This event marked the beginning of the early dynastic period, a time of consolidation and state formation. During the early dynastic period, approximately 3,100 years before Christ to 2,686 years before Christ, the pharaohs established the foundations of centralized government, administrative structures, and monumental architecture. The capital was established at Memphis, strategically located at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. This period also saw the development of writing in the form of hieroglyphics, which played a crucial role in administration, record-keeping, and religious practices. The pharaohs of the First and Second Dynasties laid the groundwork for Egypt's future prosperity. They initiated large-scale irrigation projects, which improved agricultural productivity and supported population growth. The construction of elaborate tombs and mortuary complexes, such as those at Saqqara, demonstrated the growing power and religious significance of the pharaohs. The Old Kingdom and the Age of the Pyramids. The Old Kingdom, approximately 2,686 years before Christ to 2,181 years before Christ, is often referred to as the Age of the Pyramids due to the construction of the most iconic structures in Egyptian history. The pharaohs of the Fourth Dynasty, particularly Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, built the Great Pyramids of Giza, which remain some of the most impressive architectural feats in human history. The Old Kingdom was characterized by a highly centralized government, with the pharaoh considered a divine ruler, the embodiment of the gods on earth. This period saw significant advances in art, architecture, and engineering. The construction of pyramids, temples, and other monumental structures required a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and engineering, as well as a highly organized labor force. The economy of the Old Kingdom was primarily based on agriculture, supported by the annual inundation of the Nile, which deposited fertile silt along its banks. The state controlled much of the land and resources, collecting taxes in the form of grain and labor. This centralized control allowed the pharaohs to mobilize resources for large-scale construction projects and to support a complex bureaucracy. The First Intermediate Period. The stability and prosperity of the Old Kingdom eventually gave way to a period of decline known as the First Intermediate Period, approximately 2,181 years before Christ to 2055 years before Christ. This era was marked by political fragmentation, social upheaval, and economic difficulties. The central authority of the pharaohs weakened, and regional governors, known as nomarchs, gained increasing power. The decline of centralized control led to competition and conflict among various regions of Egypt. The country was divided into several competing polities, each with its own local rulers. Despite the political instability, this period also saw the flourishing of regional cultures and artistic styles. The Middle Kingdom. The reunification of Egypt under the leadership of Mentuhotep II around 2055 years before Christ marked the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, approximately 2055 years before Christ to 1,650 years before Christ. This period is often regarded as a renaissance in Egyptian history, characterized by political stability, economic prosperity, and cultural achievements. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, particularly those of the 12th dynasty, implemented significant administrative and agricultural reforms. They strengthened the central government, reasserted control over the nomarchs, and undertook ambitious construction projects. The construction of irrigation canals and reservoirs improved agricultural productivity and supported population growth. The Middle Kingdom also saw the expansion of Egypt's borders through military campaigns and trade expeditions. The pharaohs established strong diplomatic and commercial ties with neighboring regions, including Nubia, the Levant, and the Aegean. The Second Intermediate Period. The decline of the Middle Kingdom and the onset of the Second Intermediate Period, approximately 1,650 years before Christ to 1,550 years before Christ, were marked by the invasion and rule of the Hyksos, a Semitic people from the Levant. The Hyksos established their capital at Avaris in the Nile Delta and introduced new technologies, such as the horse-drawn chariot and composite bow, to Egypt. Despite their foreign rule, the Hyksos adopted many aspects of Egyptian culture and governance. The period of Hyksos rule was marked by both conflict and cultural exchange, which ultimately contributed to the development of the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom and the Age of Empire. The expulsion of the Hyksos and the reunification of Egypt under Ahmose I around 1,550 years before Christ marked the beginning of the New Kingdom, approximately 1,550 years before Christ to 1,070 years before Christ. This era, often referred to as the Age of Empire, was characterized by unprecedented military expansion, wealth, and cultural achievements. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, such as Thutmose III, Hatshepsut, and Akhenaten, expanded Egypt's borders through military campaigns and established an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to the Levant in the north. The wealth accumulated from conquests and trade allowed for the construction of magnificent temples, palaces, and monuments. One of the most famous pharaohs of the New Kingdom, Ramses II, known as Ramses the Great, ruled during the 19th dynasty. His reign was marked by extensive building projects, including the temples of Abu Simbel and military campaigns, particularly against the Hittites. The New Kingdom also saw significant religious developments. The worship of the god Ammonius Ra became increasingly important, and the city of Thebes emerged as a major religious and political center. The period of Akhenaten's reign was notable for the introduction of a monotheistic worship of the sun god Aten, although this religious revolution was short-lived. The Third Intermediate Period. The decline of the New Kingdom led to the Third Intermediate Period, approximately 1,070 years before Christ to 664 years before Christ, a time of political fragmentation and foreign invasions. Egypt was divided into several competing states, including the Kingdom of Kush in Nubia and the Libyan-influenced 21st dynasty in the Delta region. During this period, Egypt faced invasions and occupations by foreign powers, including the Assyrians and Persians. Despite the political instability, Egyptian culture and religious practices continued to thrive, with local rulers maintaining traditional customs and building projects. The late period and the influence of foreign powers. The reunification of Egypt under native rulers during the late period, approximately 664 years before Christ to 332 years before Christ, marked a brief resurgence of power and cultural revival. The 26th dynasty, also known as the Sate dynasty, worked to restore Egypt's former glory through military campaigns, economic reforms, and cultural patronage. However, Egypt's strategic location made it a target for foreign powers. The conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 years before Christ marked the beginning of the Hellenistic period. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy established the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt until the Roman conquest in 30 years before Christ.